I'm Austin Harris, the Director of Member Engagement here at KASB, and we're excited to bring you a little bit more news about Tuesday's election, the best updates we have from a race that continues to be in a little bit of flux at the national and state level. I'm joined today by our advocacy staff. We've got Leah Fleiter and Scott Rothschild here. And we are both joined this afternoon by Dr. Patrick Miller from the University of Kansas, professor of political science. So he's going to help us break down some of these races this afternoon and dig into what we're seeing in trends both federally and at the state level. We've got a great mix of folks today, some members of the media, some other nonprofit folks, and many of our members with us this afternoon. As we go through the day, if you have any questions, particularly that are specific to any district or any races, go ahead and drop those in the chat. I'll be watching those throughout the afternoon, and we'll do our best to try to answer the questions you have about what has been a very interesting and fascinating election to watch, at least from the political science side of things. It maybe be stressful depending on your partisanship, but it's been nothing if not interesting. So Scott, Leah, Dr. Miller, thanks for joining us today. Scott, the federal races continue to be in flux, looking a little more like we might have an answer by the end of the day here as to who will be the next president. But why don't you kick us off in taking a look at those federal races?
Well, thank you, Austin. And Dr. Miller, I think Lee and I will probably be asking you questions. And then as people submit questions in the chat box, like Austin said, he will probably be reading those. But I just thought I'd hand it to you, Patrick. Just can you kind of parse out what has been happening over the past few hours as far as the presidential election, and also maybe provide some insight into the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House races? Those have been kind of surprising too. But I'll just give you that question and hand it to you.
Sure. And so just to clarify, so U.S. House and U.S. Senate kind of national level picture? Or,
yeah. Okay. And then later, if you want to drill down into Kansas too, that'd be fine.
Sure. So, I mean, I'm sure you all are staying on top of your ballot counting. I think we're pretty much where many people thought we would be at this point, where, we really had a record number of ballot requests this year, and a big partisan divide in that. I mean, usually mail ballots are nothing new, but usually there's a much smaller number of them. Usually there's not a big partisan divide in that. In fact, oftentimes Republicans have done better with mail ballots because it was Republicans who were more likely to request them. But this year, I think given COVID concerns, there was really just a gigantic in some states, hundreds of % increase in the number of mail ballots requested, and far more Democrats requesting them. So, your election day votes or your later early votes were much more Republican. In many states, Republicans not getting that many mail ballots. And these ballots that are now being counted do tend disproportionately more Democratic this year because of Democrats requesting those. Of course, it takes a while to count this many ballots, especially when they can come in up to election day, or in some states like Kansas after election day. You can't count all those in an instant, especially with the hand counting procedures that are in place and the electoral judges in many states having to examine every ballot. But I think, we're pretty much in a very expectable, if that's a word, place with that. I'd rather be Joe Biden than Donald Trump at this point, and I guess I would say in terms of the Electoral College. U.S. Senate, not that many surprises. I think most people really looked at Senate control as a toss-up. Maybe the one state that might be a little surprising based on the polling is North Carolina, but we know that the Republican was surging there at the end. And appears to have maybe won by a bit less than 1%. And we knew that, late deciders in the election, per the exit polls, which were actually really good, they were substantially Republican. So both Senate seats in Georgia will be heading to a runoff. If Democrats can win those, which is a challenge because runoffs in Georgia, the Democratic vote drops off disproportionately. But if they were able to win those, that would tie the Senate with how the Senate is looking now, give Democrats effective control with a vice president if they have one. The House is on track to keep a Democratic majority, though Democrats have lost some seats. Mainly those seats they picked up in 2018 that were really quite Republican to begin with. So for example, a seat in Oklahoma City that still voted for Donald Trump by a nice margin, but less than it did for Mitt Romney. Those are the kind of seats where Democrats are suffering some losses. Republicans have a few losses in the House level as well, but Democrats will probably keep a smaller majority there. Here in Kansas, we very much have status quo in our U.S. House races. All of your incumbents reelected, no switches in the party districts. The Senate outcome, perhaps not that surprising. The polling here in Kansas showed that amongst voters who had an opinion, which is a very important distinction, having an opinion versus being undecided, amongst your voters who had an opinion, there really was no clear leader between Roger Marshall and Barbara Bollier. But if you averaged it out, Roger Marshall had maybe a 3 to 4 point lead. But those undecided voters, we knew, leaned to Donald Trump for the presidency by about 2 to 1. And we know that your late deciders did break markedly more Republican. So, I think in some states we have to look at the polling and see what happened. And in some states, even states where people are saying, well, what happened here with the polls? There were some pollsters who did a very good job. So there's a lot there. Beware of the hot takes on the polling front. But in Kansas, I'm really not actually that concerned about the quality of the polling when you factor in, what that average in the polls looked like, and then really what your undecided voters in that race looked like. But we did end up having a very expensive race and a lot closer than it normally is. And there are lots of changes happening internally in Kansas, even if that did end up being a Roger Marshall win. So lots of interesting things to watch in the state with political trends, not just this year, but going forward.
Dr. Miller, do you think, we saw an incredible amount of money being raised by Democrats statewide and nationwide, and it really didn't seem to pan out like they probably thought, or, those of us who kind of follow it, you see those fundraising numbers and, you may or may not accurately think that's going to automatically translate into votes. So you want to talk a little bit about that money issue?
Sure. And also whoever's running the meeting, I had a screen pop up. I did not mean to press that button requesting on the bottom. I'm really messing up on my Zoom today. So yeah, ignore any request you just got from me. What have I been doing this? You'd think I wouldn't make mistakes. Money. So yeah, money doesn't buy elections. Great Kansas example. Tell Greg Orman that. Most of your self-funders, your biggest self-funders in politics typically lose. And even when candidates are not self-funding, money does not always determine the election outcome. I think political scientists, we've been studying money in politics for so long that it's clear to us that the key is spending enough. And at some point you reach this saturation point where just spending more isn't that effective. And what is effective is your message or the kind of district you're running in. I think certainly Democrats were very well funded in legislative races this year. But it does illustrate that, money's not going to win the election when you're trying to win a district that maybe has a 10-point Republican performance advantage. Now, Democrats that money, I think, did help move the needle substantially. I think, for example, places like Northeast Wichita or Leawood or Olathe that not that long ago were 2 to 1, 3 to 1 Republican in how they voted. But yet, even though Republicans won the elections there, they were winning by 4 or 5 points. Money probably did help Democrats at the margins there, but those are areas, those are communities that are transitioning, just like much of rural Kansas has transitioned to being a lot more Republican. We don't have any Democrats left in Southeast Kansas, and that transition didn't happen overnight. Those will be communities to keep watching politically. And both parties will have a chance to compete in those communities. But I think it is clear, just like it was in 2018 and 2016, when Republicans were outspending Democrats in a lot of key legislative races that they still lost. Money is not necessarily what's going to get you that win in these elections.
Not seeing any questions in the chat. Maybe we'll just go ahead and kind of transfer all the way into our local Kansas discussion. Why, and we've talked about it a little bit already here, but why do you think Republicans made gains, and were there any surprises that you saw?
I'm not really surprised by any of the election outcomes. I think for me, something I was agnostic about is what was going to be the outcome in some of these communities that are a lot more transitional right now. I think a lot of people expected, and I think I really only appreciated this afterwards, consuming some of the social media chatter, that I think people expected this blue wave, right? I mean, I don't think that was ever a justifiable expectation. Before the election, I was going to be interested in like what was going to happen in places like Newton or Hutchinson or Pittsburgh, where you have Democrats in the legislature in districts that, when it comes to state politics, are a lot more Democratic. But at the federal level, when you have Donald Trump on the ballot, they like their Republicans. And Democrats suffered some losses in those communities, probably, top of the ticket effects, especially bringing out those voters who might not typically vote in a midterm election when Democrats might do better in those areas. So I wasn't sure what to expect there. And those kind of Trump, Laura Kelly communities that maybe even voted for Paul Davis that, back in 2014, they ended up being better for Republicans this time around. I was also pretty agnostic about what was going to happen in places like Johnson County that take you back just a few elections, very Republican. I mean, they've changed a lot, and areas like inside 435 have become really solidly Democratic, but there's still big chunks of that community that are changing. And I think we're probably going to be able to get some better data looking at the precinct numbers soon, and seeing that we have some ticket splitters. I think when we dig down at the precinct numbers, we might be surprised by the indications of like the people voting for a Joe Biden and a Kelly Warren for the state Senate. I think there's probably going to be a healthy number of those kind of voters, at least in this election.
Dr. Miller, when we look at races really across the country, that idea of ticket splitting seems to be pretty prevalent. We're seeing Joe Biden consistently outperform Senate candidates of his own party in swing states like Georgia. Is that unique to this election, or is that something we see with some regularity?
Ticket splitting is, it's always been a phenomenon. I mean, even way back before we had surveys, back to the beginning of the Republic, we can see it. For much of the 20th century, when there was a lot of ideological diversity in both parties, moderate and liberal Republicans and conservative and moderate Democrats, ticket splitting existed in much higher numbers than what we see now. Sometimes up to 35% of Americans might split their tickets in an election. In recent decades, we've had a decrease in ticket splitting. The ticket splitting that we do see these days, outside of something like what we saw in Kansas, where there was some specific discontent around a Sam Brownback, and that had an effect for a while. The ticket splitting that we've seen more recently is really voters kind of realigning. So a lot of the ticket splitting we had seen in the past 20 years was people who were, particularly more rural voters, white working class voters, voting Republican for president, but then voting for your more conservative Democrats down ballot. Those voters are pretty much now uniformly Republican. And they started to transition really before your suburban voters did in large numbers. So since 2016, what we see is your ticket splitting is tending to be more your voters who are Democratic at the top of the ticket but they're traditionally Republican voters, and so they're sticking with Republicans down ballot. Those voters may well fully transition over to being Democrats at some point, just much like rural Americans have done to with Republicanism. Or they may stop. They may be habitual ticket splitters for a while. But you look at counties like Johnson County and similar counties and districts around the country, and it's really evident, at least in this election, we have a lot of these on the local level, presidential Democrats, but down ballot Republicans. And it's going to be an interesting phenomenon, particularly in suburbia, to watch.
We do have a question from the chat real quick. Question is for you, Dr. Miller, do you think COVID had an impact on the state elections, especially in places like Johnson County where parents have organized to get students back in the classroom and there's been some resistance to hybrid or online learning?
There's no one piece of evidence I can look at and say, yeah, that shows that, right? Like, we can look at the exit polls, which did a good job gauging the election outcome, and say, yeah, these kind of ticket splitters, for example. I think on that front, what we can anecdotally say is what there doesn't seem to be a connection on is how much particular communities have or are suffering from COVID. Right now, the counties with the highest infection rates and the greatest increasing number of hospitalizations are tending to be our more rural and Republican communities, many of which actually voted for Donald Trump in larger numbers than they did in 2016. So I don't think that is necessarily a logic that we're going to see pan out, that the worse your community did, maybe the more you veered away from Trump. I think there's probably no correlation there. I do wonder, because we look at the exit polls and COVID voters who, there seems to be kind of two kinds of voters. There's the voter who thought that COVID's not being handled well in general, and maybe more so by Donald Trump, but it also wasn't necessarily the issue they cared about the most. And I think with Kansas here and elsewhere, what we see is those voters who cared the most about COVID were tending to be more Republican, which to me says, again, here and elsewhere, that the anger maybe around the restrictions was more something on the right. And I think the local organizing is a reflection of that. But I think it's more than just the organizing around that, whether it's in Johnson County or elsewhere. I think just with all the restrictions we've seen with schools, with masks, it's really something that I think we might look back at all the data afterwards and say mobilized conservatives more than it did anyone else.
Well, and I think when you were talking about COVID, and obviously this has affected how schools have reopened. I know in Johnson County, there was a lot of debate. There were a lot of heated meetings about school openings and closings. And you may have touched upon this already, but do you think that had any effect, especially in the Shawnee Mission and those kinds of areas in Johnson County, that, I don't know, disgruntlement with the way the opening of school was handled, whether we're going to play football, things like that? Do you think that may have had any, or is it just impossible to tell at this point on some of those legislative races?
I think it is impossible to tell. And I think part of what we don't have awesome data on like specifically what happened in Johnson County. So I think part of the challenge is taking what we know from state and national exit polls and then using that to infer down to the community level. I think, if we look at generally Republican messaging late in the campaign, I think in Kansas and elsewhere, it was really centered on protests and social unrest / defunding the police, and also the COVID restrictions. And I think if you pair that up with what data from Kansas and elsewhere suggest, that your undecided voters broke heavily Republican at the end. If those voters were truly undecided, or if there were voters who were truly undecided about whether to vote, and then so their decision was just to come out, but they were normally Republican, then I think there's a very credible narrative there that the backlash around COVID restrictions played a role in that. You know, if that was something that mobilized conservatives or that persuaded people to vote more conservatively, even at small numbers, that could have a quite substantial impact in a lot of communities. But I really just think it's a credible narrative, but not something that we can definitely have that smoking gun piece of evidence for.
Do you think with, you know, we have the Republican Party that maintained its super majorities in both houses, and has generally at caucus has become more conservative. What do you think that means for some of these recent hot button issues like healthcare, constitutional amendments, Gannon, those types of things?
Yeah, so so there are some interesting dynamics there. I guess before we jump over to that, I see that Kathy Waller asked a
Right.
so kind of, yeah. So why don't I address that and then we'll jump over to that. So the exit poll data actually ended up being very good. The concern with the exit poll data was whether the exit polls would be able to accurately catch people who voted because people were voting by mail in such large numbers. And it really looks like they did. You know, the challenge with pre-election polling is that you're trying to estimate what a population of people looks like when that population doesn't exist yet. You're trying to figure out what voters are going to look like in a week or a month or so forth before they've even voted. And that's where a lot of the disagreement with polling comes in, where some pollsters can be more or less correct. Exit polling is actually a lot easier to do because you're surveying people oftentimes at the polling places and you know they voted. So exit polling is almost always much more accurate. Even in 2016, when we had maybe some issues in national polling, much more accurate. So I think we can definitely have, because of how they're done, a lot more confidence in the exit polling, even if some of our pre-election polling is really hit or miss in some places. So I would say separate those two things because they're two very different animals. So with the Kansas outcome, and I would say if you want exit poll data for Kansas, Fox AP did another one this year, their exit poll, and they did one in 2018. So we do have some good exit poll data from Kansas on that, and easy to Google. I tweeted it the other day. If you follow me, you can find the link. With the legislative outcomes, so yeah, there's going to be, I think, a really big impact. Not just with Democrats, you know, I mean, they hold even in the state Senate. They could lose up to 5 seats in the House, but that's not guaranteed. Some races are undecided. You know, the bigger impact is going to be moderate Republicans almost being eradicated in the primaries. Mostly in districts that are so Republican, Democrats could never compete there. So, you know, that conservative tilt was going to be baked in because of a lot of those rural districts. So, you know, I think one result of that would be there's a strong potential for much more conservative leadership, even than what we've seen with Susan Wagle and Ron Reichman, just because you're going to have a lot more conservatives and a lot of new conservatives as well, who are not necessarily as wedded to the older leadership. They don't have those ties. So that's, you know, one possibility. Definitely, if you're thinking about how polarized the legislature is, you know, given that your losses seem to be more moderate Democrats, and then we've had moderate Republicans really just eviscerated, the legislature will probably be more polarized, not as many people in the middle, and the middle is not going to be as decisive. So if we're thinking of something like veto overrides, you know, I think of like who's going to be in the Senate after this election, and there's only 2 Republicans in the Senate that I can think of who will be in the Senate who I think are generally more on the moderate side. A couple here and there who maybe on some votes might vote with the moderates occasionally. But I think in the Senate, if conservatives stick together, they'll have just enough to override any gubernatorial vetoes. The House is a little less certain. Certainly it's going to get more conservative. and it will be easier for conservatives to override vetoes because they'll have to convince fewer moderates. But I think moderate Republicans, even though their numbers will be very small, they could be decisive on some types of votes. So, in our legislature, moderate Republicans tend to be very similar to conservatives on your social and cultural issues. So there's not as much of an impact on many of those issues because there's not really a divide. Your education and your tax issues tend to elicit those stronger divisions between moderates and and conservatives. And I think it's any overrides on those issues where really the vote by vote math of how those few moderate Republicans who are left, how they're going, could be very decisive on veto overrides.
You've touched a lot about. I was Googling that Fox AP while you were talking, and it was pretty extensive. You were talking about Johnson County a lot, and I was wondering if you could just kind of briefly go into what happened in Shawnee County. Anthony Hensley, who's been around for 40 plus years, lost a race. And another question I had was, what do the Democrats do, if anything, about Aaron Coleman, the representative-elect in Wyandotte County? So yeah.
Well, Shawnee County is interesting. It has diversity inside of it, much like Sedgwick or Johnson County does. And so, the wealthier suburban parts of Shawnee County, so I'm thinking like the district that Brenda Dietrich is going to represent in the state Senate, that side of Topeka, actually got more Democratic in this election. And so that's kind of resembling what you see with Johnson County or Northeast Wichita. The part of the county that Anthony Hensley represents is much more working class, and also, it is genuinely a Republican district, but one that has voted more Democratic in state elections. So Anthony Hensley really has succeeded for a very long time until now at getting those ticket splitters that just didn't seem to be there for him in this election. I also wonder with his race in particular, his district is literally like right across the street from mine. And if I walk across the street, which I do a lot of walking, you wouldn't have known that he was running for office in West Lawrence. Joe Biden, Barbara Boyer, Michelle de Isla signs everywhere, but what was missing was him. Yard signs don't win elections, but I do wonder what that says about the quality of his campaign and the voter outreach, what kind of presence he was having in some place like West Lawrence, where he really needed to rack up a margin, but he ended up losing this part of Lawrence. So I didn't observe his campaign too closely, but I would just kind of wonder with that. Aaron Coleman, oh boy. Yeah, so, all right, so he won, for better or worse, he won. And I think there's gonna be a real question mark here. So if we look at instances around the country, and I can't think of an instance recently in Kansas, but if we look at instances in other state legislatures or Congress where someone is expelled after being sworn in, or they refuse to be seated, these instances are very rare, and they relate typically to wrongdoing while in office or criminal activity. So what he has done before being sworn in, even if it got him in trouble with the law, even if he's admitted to doing some very bad things, would be unusual for not seating or expelling him. So that will be an interesting fight. I think if there's anything that may be a more credible trigger for that, it's his tweet this last week, which he insists was talking about a political hit, but his threat to take a hit out on the governor, which as a half Sicilian, you say that to me, and I'm like, you know, mafia people. That's what that sounds like. I think that's where most people's mentality goes, but he says political hit. I think that more than anything is probably going to get him in trouble. But I think it will be interesting politics and perhaps some uneasy politics dealing with him, even whether he gets seated. Yeah.
Are there any options for particularly the Democratic caucus regarding Aaron Coleman to kind of shun him out of the caucus, even if he is seated and they can't expel him from the legislature? Can they, for lack of a better term, kind of put him in the corner and leave him alone for the next 2 years?
Oh, absolutely. As conservatives have done to moderates in many recent years. You know, in the legislature, in our legislature and elsewhere, it's really parties that control committee assignments, for example, or have a huge influence over that. It would not be unprecedented for him to, you know, not be. I mean, he would still be a Democrat in the legislature, but not be let into the Democratic caucus or not be treated as a part of it, and then perhaps not get committee assignments out of that. That would be feasible, and then just wait him out and hope that he loses a primary in 2 years, which could be possible if Democrats find someone who actually runs a campaign this time around. Yeah. How did Stan Fraunfelter lose that? I mean, that's probably a whole other conversation to have. Again, you know, I think if you're a Democrat in Kansas, you have to do a lot of a self-assessing of the quality of your campaigns, especially with some of your older incumbents who have been around quite a while and what kind of campaigns they're running. I think it probably says a lot more about what Stan Fraunfelter did than what Aaron Coleman did that Coleman won. And that's a very Democratic district. So it's not unreasonable that the next primary could just take care of the issue. You know, I mean, I think he's not exactly demonstrating on social media right now a tendency to, shall we say, adopt the maturity that maybe a representative-elect might be wanted to have. So interesting politics, yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about the legislative leadership races. We know we're going to have a change in the Senate. We know that Senator Ty Masterson announced the other day he's in a race for Senate President. I think we assume that Vice President Longbine from Emporia is also interested in advancing. We know Carolyn McGinn's interested in Senate Majority Leader, and then Representative Reichman, you know, announced that he's going to run for a third term as Speaker. And, you know, we're hearing that, you know, he may see a more conservative challenge. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that's very unpredictable at this point, quite frankly. And seeing these possible contests for leadership come up, I mean, I think it's something that you can expect with such a large Republican majority. You know, Reichman, if he were to get another term as Speaker, it would be pretty unprecedented as far as recent Kansas history goes. There's no rule against it. You know, if you have your ear to the ground and the rumbling inside Topeka, you've heard about, you know, the possibility of a more conservative challenge to him and some of the divisions that have been in the caucus between the people who are pretty conservative, very conservative, and the ones who are even more conservative. So I would just be watching that. I don't think I have any special insight on that, but I would not be surprised to see a more conservative challenger emerge and possibly even, you know, be victorious over Speaker Reichman in that case, because those divisions are real. I think you're seeing that on the Senate side now in a more advanced way. You know, and I think Masterson's probably best advantage in that is this crop of new super conservatives who are going to be coming in, or likely super conservatives from the primaries, and some of the general election wins as well. So, I think kind of the more traditional, I don't think of Longbine as a moderate. I think of him as someone who is a conservative with some moderate tendencies occasionally. There's not really a moderate block much of one left. So I think, that he'd probably be a more conventional pick for more traditional conservatives, but I think there could be some very close division there in that caucus. I just think there's probably a lot of interesting politicking going on internally for those Republicans at the moment.
So Patrick, transitioning a little bit, I don't see any more questions in the chat. If you have some, feel free to drop those in there. We seem to know pretty well what the state of the legislature is going to be and kind of that makeup of both chambers of the House. So as we look to the next legislative session, what do you see as you kind of look into the crystal ball and look at the future, especially pertaining to things like redistricting, even how school board elections are run in the next year? And are there some candidates that you think are going to start positioning themselves for a race against Laura Kelly 2 years from now?
Sure. I guess let's deal with things chronologically. We will have local elections in Kansas this next year. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a lot of heated school board races, quite frankly, in some of, back to one of the earlier questions, in some of these communities where you've had some real contentiousness around what happens with the schools. And not necessarily even a partisan thing necessarily, but maybe just the COVID restrictions dividing voters in all kinds of interesting ways. Those are very low turnout elections typically. And so a very small group of organized people on either side of that issue can have a very big impact. So I think, school board members who, I would say, I would not want your job at this unenviable position that those elected officials are in and the decisions they're having to make. But I think that, many of them could find themselves with some pretty aggressive challengers this year, challenging them on these restrictions. And I think those school board members are really going to have to defend what they did and the pros and the cons pretty strongly against some of those challenges. So that would be a very interesting thing to watch, but I don't pretend to have any kind of crystal ball to tell you how that will pan out in the end. I think, with what we're seeing in the legislature, on policy, conservatives are going to be a lot more advantaged, obviously. I don't think there's any question that we'll see the abortion constitutional amendment on a state ballot. Question is kind of when. When Republicans might choose to put that on the ballot to be more advantageous for themselves, I think is the more questionable thing right now, when that would be. Redistricting is going to be very interesting. So, and this is redistricting for the state legislature and the congressional level. So 10 years ago, the redistricting process failed politically in Kansas because the nugget of the problem was that conservative Republicans and moderate Republicans were both trying to shaft each other with the maps. And as a result, maps didn't get passed and it all went to the courts and the courts drew the lines. So the maps we have now in Kansas are actually not gerrymandered by either party. They generally follow county and city lines. They tend to make sense. They've preserved Republican majorities, but they've allowed some competition to exist. I think Democrats would have been happy with the status quo. Knowing they were never going to get a majority, but they could compete. Republicans, obviously could do better because they didn't get that chance to gerrymander the map last time, but now they can. If they keep their caucus together and override the governor's vetoes. So I think there could be some pretty substantial changes to state legislative districts and who represents you. Take a community like Manhattan, for example. Riley County is getting more Democratic, voted for Joe Biden, the first time it's ever voted for a Democrat for president. By itself, it's probably going to be more than a state Senate district in this next election. So you would have to be in at least 2 state Senate districts if you went by population. But it's also surrounded by a lot of very Republican area. So, Manhattan is the kind of community that you could divide Riley County up between multiple Senate districts and eliminate Senator Hawke in that way. Now, of course, Manhattan would probably lose having a district centered on it, but partisan politics is partisan politics. So I think a lot of communities, particularly our smaller cities, Newton, Hutchinson, Pittsburgh, Emporia, where Democrats have been more competitive on a local level, could find themselves dissected into some interesting new lines. The congressional map's going to be interesting, and that will, of course, affect the entire state. The challenge for Republicans there is Johnson County. It's, of course, getting much more Democratic, but by itself, it's 80% of a congressional district. 10 years ago, Republicans, their leading map that ultimately failed, but their top contender would have taken Wyandotte County and ran it into a district out to Colorado, put Lawrence in a district that ran down to southwest Kansas, Dodge City, Garden City, liberal, and then put Johnson County in a district that ran down to Oklahoma. The Wichita area would have stayed pretty intact. That map, even now, is pretty risky for Republicans, with as large as Johnson County is and as Democratic as it's getting. There has been some talk about dividing Johnson County into multiple congressional districts. That could be a more effective strategy. If you take Johnson County and you break it up into 2 or 3 parts and then run each part far out into rural Kansas, then you can neutralize Johnson County. Of course, you're creating some interesting marriages. Leawood in a district with what? With Salina, with someplace near Wichita. I mean, it would not be a pretty map, but it could be an effective and probably legal map to eliminate Sharice Davids. So I think kind of what's happening there, because it's our largest county, is really going to impact how our map statewide is going to look. But precisely what it's going to look like, you can't really know right now.
Okay, any final questions in the chat as we wrap up here? Leah, Scott, any final questions for Dr. Miller today?
I think I'm in good shape. Go ahead, Scott.
No, I was just gonna, the redistricting issue is going to be very interesting, and I know I'm a close observer of Texas politics, and I think Patrick Miller is too. And there's some creative redistricting going on there that probably Kansas will take lessons from in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I mean, both parties are guilty of this.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
Maryland congressional map is ugly. And Democrats had to do that to, create a 7-1 map in their favor. Democrats are kind of in this good government mentality right now, where they're like they're actively disarming their own ability to gerrymander maps. Like in Virginia, they could have gerrymandered the state. It's a Republican gerrymander right now, and they've succeeded under it. But they put a constitutional amendment on the ballot to put redistricting into a nonpartisan commission. So it's like, okay, Republicans wouldn't have done that. So Republicans have really kept that power themselves, and are going to be in a much better position to draw maps than Democrats. Not just because of their electoral wins, but again, because Democrats like these nonpartisan commissions. But yeah, Texas is a very aggressive gerrymander last time around. Austin, for example, is broken up into 6 different congressional districts when it could just be 2 if you kept the county intact. And some things like that, it's what you have to do on either side to get the outcome that you want. Someone asked, do you think Johnson County Republicans will allow it to be split? I mean, I'm not in their heads. I can't tell you for sure, but I look, for example, at a lot of other states where you have large counties like Johnson County, Jackson County, Missouri, Kansas City is a great example. It's unnecessarily split. And these tend to be very partisan decisions where, even Jackson County Republicans in Missouri were voting to break Johnson County into different pieces. Or when Democrats gerrymander maps, they vote to break their own communities apart. It seems that most of the time politicians, if you give them the ability to draw the map, they're not outsourcing it to a commission, they'll generally just go with party. Even if that means that the lines in their own backyards are not particularly pretty. I think especially with the Johnson County Republicans that we're going to have, I mean, there's going to be no moderate Republicans in the legislature from Johnson County. They're all going to be quite conservative. And I think just that ideological split might create a little less incentive to keep the county intact when the potential beneficiary of that is Sharice Davids.
Okay. Well, Scott and Leah, a couple notes for our viewers. We are expecting the consensus revenue estimates out sometime today. Those will have some potentially important implications on the budgetary negotiations that'll happen next year in the state legislature, looking at the revenue coming in. And then, of course, they'll have to compare that to the expenditures they make next year. Obviously, some concerns around the impact COVID-19 has had on revenue this year and what that might mean, particularly for education funding. So for our viewers and our members, we're going to be keeping an eye on that today and into the weekend. We'll try to have some updates for you in the beginning of the new week about what that might mean for K-12 funding, and certainly what could be a fight between Governor Kelly and the legislature over how to redo some of that budget. And not seeing any final questions in the chat. Dr. Miller, thank you so much for joining us today and for your insight into both the state and federal elections. It was fantastic. Scott, Leah, thanks as always for joining us, and we will see you all later.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.